The Lead Icon Podcast.
Shape the future. Lead with purpose. Go iconic.
Today, I am interviewing Father Stephen David, who is the head of Academy of St. John of Kronstadt Academy, a classical Orthodox education school in Brisbane, Australia. Now, what makes this interview very important and why you should watch it is that we explore a completely new education system. Well, it's not that new. It's actually a tried and tested system that's been around for over 2,000 years. And it is growing fast. For example, in the States, there's 1,500 schools, and they're about 20, 30 years ahead of us here. Now, there are classical education schools here in Australia. However, there are different types. So let's explore what classical education is, why is it important, because we have to think about our future generations. What are we leaving for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Father Stephen David, to the Lead Icon podcast. It's lovely to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Father, you and I have known each other for a little bit now, and when I first met you, you were not only a corporate lawyer working in the Australian federal government, you had just become, I think, a priest. You'd taken on your vows as a priest, and you're now based in Brisbane. So when I met you then, I was always in awe of, especially your sermons, because you gave great sermons, after church or during liturgy. Then I found out that you were looking at starting a school, and not just any other school. So that transition from, being a corporate lawyer to running a school or starting a school, that was not only inspiration from my point of view, but also a big undertaking. So what was the starting point for all of this? How did this all begin for you?
Yeah, thanks, Tiana. It is a very strange trajectory to take, and not one that I expected, but it was instigated with the birth of my daughter. And one of the things I started thinking about very early on was her education. Now, I was educated in the Catholic school system through the 80s. I don't think I got an especially outstanding education, I have to say. It was pretty mediocre. But then you fast forward, 25 years, I've been out of school for a long time. And the state of education has been on the decline for decades. And what I started seeing and hearing through family and friends about what was going on in schools, but also reading about, in reading, writing, and arithmetic, Australian students continue to regress as opposed to their peers in other countries. And I just felt that there was something missing. But I think even more than that, education in Australia has become, as in, I think, for many Western countries, very utilitarian. It's just about getting into a good university to get a good job. Why? So that you can afford the car, the boat, the houses, all those sorts of things. And I just felt that that's not why we educate. I don't want my children being educated to become consumers and materialists. That's not what I want for my children. As an Orthodox Christian, I want to see them inherit the kingdom of heaven. First of all, I don't want them making the mistakes that I made. I want them to do better than me. And so of course, I started looking around Australia. The education system in Australia, you've got the public school system, then you've got about 40% of the Australian education system is the Catholic education system, which thank God for it, because it keeps the education system buoyant, right? And then you've got independence. I was aware of Orthodox schools in Sydney. I grew up in Sydney. My brother was deputy principal and then principal of the Coptic Orthodox colleges in Sydney. My sister-in-law is a teacher. But none of them was really meeting the objectives I wanted for my daughter. And so I started looking worldwide and, came across different countries with different systems. Finland in particular, for example, has been in the top 5 countries in the world for education for about the last 30 years. And there's a reason for that. It's interesting. Finland, there's a few things that make it different. Firstly, children start school at 7. Secondly, to become a teacher in Finland, you have to graduate at a master's level and not just pass. You have to get a sufficient mark to be able to become a teacher. But their teachers are also the second highest paid occupation in Finland. We pay our teachers next to nothing. And so, we got to the point where we were seriously considering just packing up and moving to go somewhere better. And then providentially, somebody at my parish gave me a book titled The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher. And in this book was a chapter about classical education. I'd never heard about this before. And in Australia, I use this not in a disparaging way. We're very ignorant of the history of education. And I came across this thing, classical education, a form of education that lasted for over 2,000 years. And this appeared in the mid-20th century. And what really grabbed me was it started with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and the whole purpose of it was to cultivate the whole person to become a good member of their society, to develop wisdom and virtue and eloquence, and had nothing to do with a job. Interestingly enough, until the mid-20th century, classical education never focused on what job you were going to do. It was about the person. And so we faced a dilemma. When I researched it, the resurgence of classical schools in the US was well and truly up and running. We could either, and from the minute I read it, I went down the rabbit hole and read everything I could. I spoke to the most prominent people in the US who were involved in classical education, Dr. Christopher Perrin, Andrew Kern. They were all wonderful and gave their time to me. And I was sure that this, a liberal arts education that involved the 7 liberal arts, the great books, that they were going to be exposed to the best of the best that has ever been said or written. I was convinced. And so the dilemma was, do we pick up and leave? Or, which would kind of be selfish in some ways, which you can understand, or do we create a school here and support and give opportunities for more families to give their children a better form of education? And so that's how the idea for it came about. I approached my ruling bishop at the time and said I'd like a blessing to independently pursue this. He gave it the blessing and gave his support behind it, and started in Canberra, but then I moved to Brisbane. I got the blessing to move it up to Brisbane. And yes, that's how we end up with the St. John of Kronstadt Academy up here in Queensland.
So in terms of the classical Orthodox model, it's the first of its kind in Australia.
Yes.
And when you read about classical education, and I think Joshua Gibbs, beautifully describes this in many of his writings, that there are classical education models and there are classical education models.
Yeah. Yep.
And quite simply, when you describe what classical education is, it's the love of things that are old, right? It's the love of things that are timeless.
Yes.
Old books, old movies, old paintings, old artistry, all of these things. Now, how do you feel that sits in today's modernity? Because, like you've just explained really well how the modern system we've got literacy rates are low. Like in a country like Australia, literacy rates shouldn't be at the levels that they are.
Sure.
So what does classical education in the model that you've created, how does it address not only these problems, but also deal with this modernity issue?
Yeah, good question. Let me deal with the first one, dealing with the academics. Now, for some time, the Australian curriculum, by the way, it was only in the, I think it was maybe, I have to get my date right on this, but the Australian curriculum is a relatively recent phenomenon. It may have been 2013 that it came in. And ever since that time, they keep revising it and revising it. And actually what's been happening is they keep lowering the standard to try and hopefully get the students to meet the standard, right? It's instead of lifting them up, we'll just drop the standard. And that's what's progressively been happening, and watering it down and basically just removing so much from the curriculum that doesn't work to, getting more people into the job market. And so the classical education, what it does is it focuses on the things that, well, it gives them what I term is a true education. It gives them a real education. And how do we do that? Well, one thing is the programs that we use. The classical education is made up of the seven liberal arts. That's the trivium, the three ways, and the quadrivium, the four ways. And the trivium, the three ways, is made up of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And, at the grammar phase, which is the phase that you roughly we're in, you're always doing all three of them. But in primary school, it's the accumulation of the basic building blocks they need to learn. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric, by the way, are not subjects. They are tools for learning. And so, for example, we focus very, very heavily, far more than the curriculum requires, on phonics. And look, the schools for quite a while have played with the idea of whole word. There is a big move back to phonics, but phonics, a very strong foundation in phonics, for example, so that they can learn to read well by being able to decode, which makes them confident readers. And I see this, my 6-year-old son is here at the academy, and he will sit there with Cat in the Hat, and he gets to a word that's difficult, and he's able to decode it. He may not always get it 100% right, but he's got the tools to do it. So there's the programs that we use that lay a very solid foundation to then build on. But there's some other aspects of classical education that are really important. Our pedagogy. So festina lente, make haste, which means make haste slowly. You need to go faster, you need to go slower. That's the paradox. And it all comes back to Aesop's fable, the tortoise and the hare. And so we go slower. Australian schools, by the way, the word school comes from the word scolae, which means leisurely. There is nothing leisurely about Australian schools at all. They're ridiculously busy places. It's like, get them from one subject to the next. You got to tick off everything under the curriculum. We just got to get through this content. You got to slow things down. Or multum non multa, much not many. And this is a very big point. We don't try to do 20 things superficially and shallowly. We would prefer to do 4 things and do them with depth. Right. And that's how we run. And so using a mix of the programs and the pedagogy, ensures, and also class sizes. So we will not expand our class sizes between anything more than 16 to 18 students. On average, many schools, including Catholic schools, are running class sizes of 28 to 30. A teacher cannot give the time and the attention that's required, but also the culture within the classroom is very negatively impacted. And this is not just random numbers that I'm just pulling out of thin air. This comes out of the experience of many schools in the US where it's working. So hopefully that addresses the first part of the question. And I should say, again, with the academics, look at the US model, and classical school students in the US they pass the SATs, their equivalent of their HSC, on average in the top 10 to 15%. And it's no exaggeration. They are being courted and approached by some of the best and most prestigious universities in the US and colleges. These students are head and shoulders above their peers, not only because they know stuff, but they can think. On to the second part of your question, to do with modernity. If I understand the question right, it's I suppose you're asking, how do they deal with modernity? How does classical education help the student deal with modernity?
Well, when you look at, for example, modernity doesn't like what is old,
Yeah, sure. Yep.
timeless. But what we're seeing is parents like it. The system and the optics is
Yes.
trying to push us in one direction, whereas we're seeing, like what you've rightly explained, that our schools have turned into, instead of places of learning, ideological places. So
Yep.
this is what I'm fascinated to find out from you. How do you reconcile with that?
So there's something about modern progressive education, which is how we term the current model we have. The first thing I would say to that is have a look at the results. Students graduate very narcissistic and very pessimistic and nihilistic. And that's because they've been fed a diet of modernity, and it's shallow and it's unhealthy, and it doesn't fill the soul. It just doesn't fill the soul. And so, people might be thinking, why would you look at old stuff? And it's because of the fact that so much of modernity does not satisfy. And yet the things that last are what last. So, you could take a cheap, trashy novel that's maybe, let's just say it's number one on the bookseller list today. The question I always ask is, do you think anyone's going to be reading that book in 50, 20 years' time? No, they're not likely to be reading it in 20 months. It's not a book that's going to last. Why is it, though, that, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Brothers Karamazov, by Dostoevsky, why are they read over and over by generations? It's because generations before us have deemed that these are things worthy for us to read and contemplate and to think about. The problem with a lot of the modernity and what's being fed to children is it's got no depth. You mentioned Joshua Gibbs, right? He gives this example in his talks all the time. He says, nobody's going to walk into the cinemas to watch the latest Transformers movie, and then a month later is going to be sitting there having a conversation to contemplate on this particular scene that happened in the movie. It's just instantaneous gratification. You walk out, you've had your fill of action, and that's it. It passes. Whereas, there's parts of particular books that you're going to go back to over and over again. So if we give our students a diet that is rich on what lasts and what is truly good, true, and beautiful, it's not a matter of being old, it's a matter of being what's fulfilling and also what teaches them how to become fully human. Taylor Swift songs don't teach us how to be fully human. The Psalms do. There's a big difference there. And so I think, especially when we're looking at what the objectives of education are, where,
you were talking about which I think is a really important point, that the spiritual component, because as you've just described, you mentioned Iliad and Dostoevsky's books, and what we lack today are character driven, movies and novels. And this goes back to also character formulation. And I know you and I have spoken this several times. Character, who I am becoming, who the child is becoming, is very important. How does the spiritual component, the mind, you've got the body, which, the classical education is great at addressing. What about the spiritual formulation, the spiritual component, so share with me what you're thinking on that is. And I've got this stat here actually where it's saying that I think there was a survey where children who where is it now? Just give me a second because I've got it here. Yeah, yes, this is it. The Barna Group in 2022 found that 81% of young adults raised with a biblical worldview felt a greater sense of purpose.
yes,
Not only in their careers but life choices, compared to 19% of their secular educated peers.
so I think it's J.K. Smith's book, Desiring the Kingdom, where he makes the statement, every pedagogy assumes an anthropology, which means for those who are listening, pedagogy is the way you go about teaching, not what you're teaching, but how you teach. And anthropology is the study of man. What he's trying to say is that even if you're a diehard atheist teacher, right, you're going to make assumptions about what that child is. You have to, because that's going to guide what you. So for us, we view the child not as a commodity, but as made by God in the very image and likeness of God, and destined to be enthroned in heaven with our Lord Jesus Christ. And so if you take a step back, John Dewey, who is considered one of the fathers of modern progressive education, was an atheist evolutionist who didn't believe that humans had a soul. You can fast forward to today, you can see the way that that's now being carried into modern progressive education. It doesn't deal with the soul at all. It doesn't even recognize that there's a soul. And so soul formation is so fundamentally important to what we do. And this also relates a bit to Charlotte Mason as well, shaping the hearts and the loves of the student. Our children will love somebody or something regardless of whether we like it or not. And the question is, who is going to shape the loves of your child? What will shape the loves of your child? And we want them to learn to love the things that are truly good and truly good, beautiful, and to develop the right loves for the right things. But also, love for God is number one. And knowing and recognizing that, what we are destined for and what is the ultimate purpose of life, which is not money and not, the wealth of this world.
It's a beautiful system, and well, more than a system, it's a complete approach. Does this approach, because once children grow up and then they go out into the world and they've got to deal with all types of thinking and ideologies. How does classical Orthodox education equip them to do that? Because you
Yep.
go out into the world and you've got to deal with things that are probably go against I guess your morals, against who you are and what you stand for. How do you feel it equips young
Yep.
young people to deal with that? Because it's getting harder and harder
Yep.
in terms of what's socially acceptable now.
Yeah. 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 So the first thing I would say to that is virtue. Um, Classical education is an education in virtue formation, and I could, of course, you've got what's called the four cardinal virtues, which are the names of our houses, um, humility, temperance, charity, and integrity. But there are a whole lot of other virtues, and such as perseverance and courage um, uh, and kindness.
Mm.
So virtue formation is fundamentally important. Again, something that's completely lacking in modern progressive education. Um, but also in answer to your question about they're going to go out into the world and they're going to have they're going to encounter a lot of things. One of the things that classical education does is it really helps them to think logically and critically. There is a saying that gets bandied around in classical education, which is it teaches them how to think, not what to think, which is not really accurate at all. But for example, when we get to year 7, we start teaching formal logic, something that is not. You turn on the TV today and watch a debate between whoever on whatever topic, and people just don't have the ability to structure a well-formed argument or even follow the logic of an argument. And it's very random and it's very emotional and it's very chaotic. Whereas formal logic helps the person to order their thinking, but also tempered by humility as well, which is very important. And so I think these are fundamentally important things, but classical education also is not about cocooning our children so that they're kind of kept away from the world. It is to prepare them for the world. So sometimes I get asked the question, what about more controversial topics? Let's take evolution as one. We'll be teaching those things. You need to teach these things and you need to engage with them and you need to have conversations about them, right? And you need to be able to, you need the student to be discussing, thinking, engaging, working through these things, because you don't want the student for the very first time walking into university on day one being confronted by a very smart academic who's running an agenda and the student has never thought about this ever, right? They'll get eaten for breakfast.
Mhm.
And so by actually engaging with these things in a very structured and well-informed way, for example, evolution is a theory. It's not it's not a fact. You still can't go from theory to fact on this one. There's still too much there to not be able to make that leap. Or for example, I don't know, gender fluidity, those sorts of things. We've got to educate our children and to help them to engage with these things in productive meaningful, well thought through ways, and eloquently as well.
Mm. It's fascinating. And when you look at, classical Orthodox education is it's the first, we started last year in 2024.
Yep.
And I know that you've been, the strategy behind, from the beginning to, each phase, you want to keep it pure and you want to keep it, on the right path. What are some of the challenges you've had in gaining traction?
Look, the biggest challenge that we have is when we talk about classical education, it's not as clear cut as you think it is. We are trying to recover a form of education, but as Dr. Christopher Perrin puts it, it's like a boat. Let's just say it's a wooden boat that has hit the rocks and is now in thousands of pieces. And what's happening is we're trying to put the pieces of the boat back together, but we don't know what the boat looked like. And so, can I tell you this? Even in the US, you've got lots of different models of classical education. There's not one definitive definition. That's not to say that it's completely arbitrary, but it's still difficult. And the biggest challenge we have is being the first in something means that we don't have another school to look to here and to model ourselves off. And so the challenges are, okay, it's all very well and good to talk about an education in virtue, but how do you practically do that? That's really hard. How do you instill wisdom? These sorts of things, it's only going to come with time and also perseverance. We have to continually be examining what we're doing and why we're doing it, and are we staying true to our vision and our mission? We're fortunate that we have a sister school in the US, Chrysostom Academy in Pennsylvania, and they help us a great deal, and it's a great model. But also, one of the biggest challenges is students coming in who are coming in from a world mindset, and also parents who they probably haven't known too much about classical education, and getting them educated in what it is we're trying to do. Because as much as we try to do it at school, they have to be supporting that in the home. And there's a bit of a battle, as you mentioned earlier, between that modernity and what we're trying to do. So it's hard because we're trying to work out what classical education, and also, by the way, we're an Orthodox classical school. The classical education is always considered the Western tradition, but we're Eastern. So then how does that play? How does that work out? These are the things we're working through. So there's quite a lot of challenges, as well as, just people not knowing what classical education is and just creating that awareness.
It's when I speak to people about it, and because education is something that both you and I absolutely love. We're both educated and we love learning.
Yeah.
They're like ducks to water when they hear about it, because it gives them a peace of mind knowing that it's a model where their child comes in and will be, you meet them where the child's at, and then you take them up. And that's another thing that I think is really important. You look at the modern schools, and we have children in going into modern schools that we know through family. One of the things I notice is that teachers spend a lot of time managing behavior rather than educating.
Yes.
So in St. John, for example, St. John of Kronstadt Academy, what's your strategy when it comes to teachers? How are teachers I guess, emboldened, empowered, that is different to, say, at another school?
Do you mean in terms of behavioral management in the classroom, or do you mean?
Behavioral management, and also, you know, it's almost like teachers have lost the love of teaching,
Yep,
you know,
yeah.
whereas,
Mm.
you know, your teachers love teaching, like they've fallen in love with it because they've all come from, you know, the
Particular
progressive,
schools.
modern progressive system. So yeah, so there's two aspects, the behavioral and the love of teaching. How do you
Yeah.
help them in that regard?
So the beauty of classical education is that it actually enables them to teach. The education system, especially through COVID, lost a huge amount of teachers. But without even COVID, the system has been losing good teachers because there's been so much administration that's being loaded on top of them and so much pressure. For example, got to get your students through all of this content, and then they have to score well in that plan because, of course, it's all about standardized testing. And all of that pressure means, and all of those extra duties means, and the way the curriculum is structured, it's not conducive to teaching as such. Whereas my teachers can teach in terms of the curriculum allows them to do that. It's a curriculum that's, very heavily based on, you know, we do lots of reading. We recite poetry. We do the Psalms, or we read like as I mentioned before, reading classical literature and doing narration. My teachers consistently say, I feel like this naturally enables me to teach, and that's because it's a curriculum that does that. In terms of behavioral management, we have certain structures in place. And this is where modern progressive education sort of really started to lose its way. We go back to the philosophy that the teacher is the authority in the room. We have rows of desks that face the teacher. We don't have group desks where students are facing each other. They're not learning from each other. The teacher is the authority in the room. They're the one that is the person there that is going to mold and guide them. Of course, there are expectations. We're Orthodox Christians for the most part, but we follow Christ. We imitate the lives of the saints, and when there is an issue, it's to be dealt with love and care, and helping the student to understand what is the right way, not just here's a punishment. It's like, well, what should you do instead? We do a lot of habit formation. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Students now in class, you say to them, listening position. And they'll know exactly what that is because we've done it 100 times. Feet flat on the floor, knees pointing towards the teacher, back straight, hands on desks, listening. And that's the, and that, by the way, habit formation is like essential for children, if we want them to be, if we want them to help regulate themselves. Now, in any class, you're going to have particular issues, and it's just got to be dealt with in a compassionate way, but also firmly. Mercy, but
What
merciful.
about with parents, say, for example, so that's teachers. So,
Yeah.
you teach in the classroom. Are those same, I guess, habit formations taught to parents so that they can, carry that on at home? Because, it doesn't just stop at the classroom. It takes a village, doesn't it,
Yes.
So how are parents involved?
Well, we talk to the parents quite a bit about, how do you support your child's education back at home? And one example we give is, um, this is something interesting. We try to teach basic etiquette to the students, right? Now, when a student walks in the morning, there's a certain way we've taught them about how you talk to and greet an adult. At the beginning, what was happening is I'd stand there and say good morning to a student. The student would just keep walking, make no eye contact at all, as if I wasn't even there, and maybe gives me a hello, but just basically ignores me. That's not that's not proper etiquette. And that's not showing respect to the person who's speaking to you, regardless of whether, by the way, it's an adult or another child. And so we went through the process. When an adult talks to you, you stop, you face them directly, and you give them, you listen to what they're saying, and then you respond appropriately. When you walk into school in the morning, sorry, when you walk into school in the morning, when you see an adult for the first time in the day, good morning, Miss Banks. Good morning, Matushka. This is basic manners. And I say to the parents at home, right, please do this, go through the same practice with your children at home. If you're talking to them, they need to stop, face you, and they need to give you their attention. It's just basic polite manners. And that habit formation, so we try to, talk to the parents as much as possible about those kind of, as I said, habits that, if you let them get away with it at home, it's not going to help at school. So we need to be consistent as much as possible. But ultimately, Diana, it's not easy to control how every household is different, and what happens in every household varies significantly. So it's
I
not.
think I think that teaching is significantly important for children, that the etiquette and the manners. Because when you look at, like when I was going through school, we had those things in place too, and like I went to a Anglican grammar school, and my parents also put me into these deportment sort of
Oh, yes.
out of school,
Mm.
because they saw the value in this, from how you treat people to how you, and I see that as a lost art. So it's wonderful to hear that you're doing that at the school also. Like, you look at today, especially in Australia, boys, men, they don't know how to approach a young girl or woman, and these are real problems. You're creating these isolated individuals who don't know how to connect. And I think that is definitely a problem that you'll get ahead of. Your
Yeah,
students
and
won't have that issue coming out of school.
yeah, and even like last year, the 3 or 4 students were doing, sorry, grade 2, 3 students were doing, like ballroom dancing, and they were learning how to work with a partner
Yeah.
to cooperate, but show that the boy would have to approach the girl and ask to dance. It's not a sexual way, which is what everything's become. Um,
Or drunk.
it,
They have to be
well,
drunk to get
exactly
the
right.
courage to ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And just learning that basic etiquette of this is how proper human beings communicate and interact. We're not teaching that at all at regular schools. In fact, um, the reports of students abusing, hitting, swearing, spitting at teachers is on the increase. And do we then expect teachers to stay in a system where that's what they've got to deal with on a daily basis? Oh, by the way, you talked about behavioral management, and there's something that's really important about a classical school, and something that's often neglected. Now I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this, and someone I'm sure listening to the podcast is going to get offended. Um, modern progressive schools are very sterile and ugly places. Really, really sterile. They're not places of beauty. And what I mean by that is there's a reason why people will fork out thousands of dollars to buy an airfare, hop on a plane, fly to the other side of the world for almost 20 plus hours to go and visit the Sistine Chapel, for example. Do you really think they're going to do that to see one of the modern buildings in Brisbane City? Absolutely not.
Mm.
There's a reason for that. So when you were talking about behavioral management, you've seen our school, of course. It is a place that is very, very beautiful. Aesthetics is important. If you surround the child with the ugly, the profane, and the defiled, that's what they become. That's why our churches are beautiful places. If you surround them with the beautiful and the inspiring, it absolutely has an impact on the child. We have beautiful icons. We have classical artworks all through our academy, beautifully framed and beautifully presented. The way the colors are combined in the classrooms, but also, this is very important. Our class, I remember my daughter when she was in grade 1 at the local Catholic school, and I went to parent teacher afternoon, and I walked in. The room was just so busy, you didn't know where to look. All this artwork is up on the walls, there's big screen TVs, and there's just stuff everywhere. In classical education, we don't do that. We keep the classroom simple, beautiful furniture, beautiful bookcases, no big screen TVs. Actually, our students get no screen time. And that has an impact on their behavior in the classroom because they stay calm. And in fact, teacher training that my teachers went through earlier this year, the presenter was talking to them about a very interesting study. And this this person asked these parents who were dealing with children with behavioral issues if he could come and observe their home. And he noticed that there were completely busy places. There was no set routines, but it was just messy, disorganized. It was chaos. He then told them to go make a whole lot of changes, simplify the environment, clean it up, keep it organized, ordered, have some routine. The reduction, I think, was like 68% reduction in the behavioral issues of the children. Because environment is really fundamentally important. So that's a big,
Yeah,
big
that
thing in
study
physical
that you
education.
just said is so spot on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, just to add to what you said, 68% of those kids' ADHD problems were eliminated.
That is
How
pretty much,
powerful. Yeah,
that's pretty much what, no medication,
no medication. Yeah.
no, but can I say, it's the same for us as adults.
Yeah.
If we have chaotic homes, right? I know as a father with 2 children myself, my wife and I are very big on routine, and they need that. But also the environment needs. In that study in particular, for example, they told the parents to get rid of all the toys and leave only 2 in the bedroom, right? And what that does is when you have a beautiful, organized environment, it brings the stress levels down for the child, and they're more calm. Now, go and have a look at what is happening in your local public school. You're not going to see that at all.
No, no, that's so true. And I often hear parents, especially on holidays, where they'll say, "Oh, you know, my kids are, you know, addicted to their screens."
Yeah.
And it's almost like parents feel powerless to change it. and they've lost, parents have, it's almost like they need some help to figure out how to get them, I guess, preoccupied with other tasks. And that requires parents to get off their phones.
Yes, and something. So we're a technology-free environment. We don't have big screen TVs in our school. We don't have iPads. We're not anti-technology. It's a matter of when and how you go about introducing that technology. It will never be the main form of education. I don't pay Apple to educate my child. I pay the school and the teacher. But most schools have moved over to iPads. Most kids have a laptop of some sort very early on. Instead of an iPad, we give them a book. I know it's a very novel idea. It's been working for centuries. But that then results in a far more engaged experience. And again, you were talking about the behavioral issues. We don't have overstimulated children in our environment looking at iPads. That absolutely has an impact on the child. So I think it's fundamentally important. We also say to the parents, and I said this to new incoming families, and I was only saying that to a parent this morning that was doing a tour of the academy. You know, parents have to if they want their child in a classical school, they're going to have to make changes at home. If they're sending them here, but then they go home and they sit in front of an iPad for the next 4 hours, that undermines everything we're doing. It's too contradictory to produce the results that we want.
You'll be pleased to know that there are several schools, and you will know this yourself, that have now taken away mobile phones. Like kids have to have it in a Ziploc, that they can't open. And the other thing is there are schools now looking at removing technology out of the schools. I know things like NAPLAN and other testing, I guess these tests are all computer based.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that the child has to have, be glued to the screens, because it's a gamification. It's a form of, it's another form of addiction that's become very acceptable.
Yes. And it makes them antisocial. But also we have been too quick to pick up these devices. And you made a very valid point, Diana. Most adults cannot control their use of smartphone. That's a fact. I think, Diana, it was you that may have sent me a talk at the latest ARC conference on this woman who gave a talk on what screens are doing, and that that wonderful story of her being on I think it was the underground tube or something, and a young man and a young woman sitting there next to each other on their mobile phones on dating apps. And she said they walked off the train, never said a word to each other, yet they're looking for a partner, and all they had to do was just look over to each other and say hello. Right? This is how ridiculous it's become. But also the more research that's coming out, it's showing us the detrimental effects that excessive screen use is having on our children. We've picked up this technology too quickly without actually thinking through and understanding the ramifications of it. I don't give my children, we don't have iPads at home. I know schools are will ask for homework to be done on iPads and so forth, and that's just more screen time on top of what they're doing at school.
It's interesting that with respects to that comment you were saying, how they're on dating apps and they're not even speaking to each other.
Yep.
This is the way of the world. Now I'd like to move now from you started up a school. Now you're the head of the academy.
Yep.
You're the founder, you're the head of the academy, and you've moved into an area now that is, it's new. You're innovative, you're visionary, Father. Talk to me about the leadership aspect of running a school of this type of nature, you know, like putting aside that it's a classical Orthodox school, but setting up a school, getting it going. How's that been for you? Like, how's that journey been for you?
It's a very, very, very steep learning curve.
Yeah.
Um, yes, one of the things about running a school is that there are, I don't like to use the term stakeholders, but there are various groups that you have to interact with and learn how to interact with. That's something I'm still learning, of course. But you know, you have the staff, the teachers, you have the students, you have the parents,
Yeah.
uh, and then we've got, for example, we've got to engage with uh, like the Commonwealth Department of Education, the Queensland Department of Education, the Non-State Schools Accreditation Board, the regulatory bodies that we have to engage with and we have to be accountable to, as well as working with a board, because every school has to have a board. And so, you know, there are a lot of, and each one of those groups requires its own approach to understand how to engage with them.
Mm.
You know, for example, parents, you know, parents are very busy, and you know, we have to be respectful of their time. But we want to also be working with them and making sure that we're partnering with them. It's not just a delegation of their responsibility onto us. The teachers, you know, having to manage staff who are very, very dedicated and committed and very busy. And how do I support their role in teaching? This, you know, the students, for example, um, you know, again, all of this in theory sounds very good. How do you actually do it in practice? And that's the $6 million question for every school, you know, classical school that's operating. And so that's all part of the learning curve, and having to understand how to adapt, how to change our way, reviewing things to change things so that I am able to interact with all those groups in a way that's going to be constructive and support our vision.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's beautiful, Father. I think, you know, your next stage of growth is exciting. You know, the school's doubled, and what would you like to see, you know, over the next couple of years? Where do you see the school? In what direction would you see it moving?
Well, the way that we've decided to establish the school is in our first year, we opened up with prep, which for those who are in New South Wales, for example, that's kindergarten, just different states, different terminology. Prep 1, 2, and 3, and then each year we're adding a grade on. So this year we added grade 4, next year grade 5, all the way through to year 12. But we're you know, one of our big I suppose goals is to find land and build a campus, a proper school campus, and that's a very, very big and lofty goal. We're currently renting premises, and which is only going to kind of accommodate us for so long. And but yes, that's our long-term goal, to make sure that we can go all the way through to year 12 and give the student a complete classical experience.
Mm. And just to end it on a I like to ask this question of industry leaders. What's your predictions for, say, the next 5 years for education? Like, where do you see education? What direction do you see it heading in?
So this is really interesting. Although COVID was not fun for anybody, COVID was one of the best things that happened to education. because what happened was you had students who had to stay at home, and we know how well that went. The students fell behind 1 to 2 years, and there's just no recovering that. But it gave parents the opportunity to actually see into the classroom and to see what was happening. And that's opened the eyes of many, many parents. Sorry. And so I think with a lot of things that came out of COVID, we've started to see the reality of things. Education is one of them. Australia is, Australia is a very prosperous country, but there, there's a veneer to that. If you scratch below that, you'll start to see some of the inherent problems we have, and education is one of them. So the prediction, I would say, is that I think as we move ahead, you're going to see more growth in independent schools. I think a lot more parents are now, I think they're starting to break out of this narrative of, school is just about getting good grades to get into university. I think more and more parents are starting to think, wait a minute, I want more than that. And so I want the academic, but I want the moral and the virtue that goes with that. I think what's interesting is the classical school movement in Australia is growing. It is absolutely growing. Not far from us, there'll be a Catholic classical school opening. I just spent 2 days with the head of the St. Benedict School in the Adelaide Hills. They opened at exactly the same time as we did last year, another classical school. But there are more schools that are being proposed, classical schools that are being proposed. And I mean, we're generally 20 years behind the US. That is what they say. If the American model is anything to go by, where you've got now over 1,500 schools, I think we could probably expect to see quite a significant increase in classical education, because even for those who want the better academics, classical education delivers that heads and shoulders. And it's not just getting good HSC results, but have a look at classically trained students who go off to these universities in the US. They are some of the highest performing students in the university. I mean, it's really, really impressive. Now, and so my view is that we're just going to continue to see that growth. The more people become aware of what it is.
You're saying that, university is a great metric, but it sounds like you're creating high functioning, well functioning, adults that can contribute in you use the words wisdom, virtue, eloquence, and I love the aspect of beauty, because when you like, it's not a vanity thing, beauty. It's it's artistic, it's creation. It's a wonderful way of learning. Father, thank you so much for your time today. It was we could speak all afternoon about this, because it touches into so many aspects of society, and we look forward to seeing, the school thrive. And any parents that are watching this particular episode, where can they reach you?
So go to our website,
Donors, or even donors.
Yes, please. Yes, we would love to hear from donors. www. St. John Academy, that's St. John Academy, all one word, .qld.edu.au. And there's a whole heap of information. You can get in touch with us through that. And yes, that would be the best way. And there's a lot on there about classical education and what we're trying to achieve.
Excellent. Thank you, Father.
Thank you very much, Tiana.